Victor Haldren grabbed Maya Kesler by the collar and threw her off the rooftop of Crestview General Hospital like she was nothing, like she was garbage. Like 7 floors of open air and concrete below meant absolutely nothing to him. He didn't even wait to hear the impact. He just straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked back through the rooftop door without a single tremor in his hands. That is the kind of man we are dealing with. That is the kind of evil that walks among us wearing a $1,000 suit and a hospital badge. Before we go any further, if this story already has your blood boiling, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened next, nobody saw coming. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels deceptively ordinary. The sun came up over Crestview General Hospital the same way it always did, slow and indifferent, casting long, pale light through the glass corridors on the 4th floor. The monitors beeped, the carts rolled. The overnight staff handed off their charts with tired eyes and coffee-stained scrubs. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. But Maya Kesler had already been at work for 2 hours before her shift technically started. She was in room 412, sitting on the edge of a chair beside an elderly man named Mr. Harold Briggs. Harold was 73 years old, a retired postal worker from a small town outside of Asheville, and he had been admitted 4 days earlier with what the attending physician had logged as routine cardiac monitoring. His daughter had called the nurse's station 3 times in 2 days, asking questions that nobody seemed to have time to answer. On the 3rd call, Maya picked up the phone. That was all it took. His potassium levels were flagged 2 days ago, Maya told Harold's daughter that evening, her voice calm and direct, the kind of voice that doesn't perform sympathy, but actually carries it. I'm going to personally review his chart tonight, and I'll have something concrete for you by morning. She did exactly that, and what she found made her jaw tighten. Harold's potassium had dipped to a level that should have triggered an immediate medication adjustment. It hadn't. The order had been entered, but then quietly removed from the system. Not deleted, just rerouted. Buried under a billing reclassification that had nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with the insurance reimbursement structure that Victor Haldren had personally pushed through the board 6 months ago. Maya didn't panic. She didn't make noise. She printed the records, tucked them into a plain folder, and set them on the desk of Dr. Patricia Osei, the head of cardiology, before 7 in the morning with a handwritten note attached. She had no idea that by doing that, she had just introduced herself to the most dangerous man in the building. Victor Haldren had been the CEO of Crestview General for 11 years. In that time, he had transformed the hospital from a mid-tier regional facility into a revenue-generating machine that impressed investors and terrified staff in equal measure. He had a gift for 2 things: appearing compassionate in public and being absolutely ruthless in private. He shook hands at charity galas and cut nursing budgets in the same week. He gave speeches about patient dignity while quietly restructuring care protocols to reduce length of stay and maximize billing cycles. He was the kind of man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was necessary, that someone had to make the hard decisions, that the numbers on the spreadsheet represented the health of the institution and therefore the health of the patients, even when they clearly did not. When his assistant placed a copy of Maya's note on his desk that morning alongside the flagged chart, Victor read it twice. Then he leaned back in his leather chair and asked, very quietly, "Who is Maya Kesler?" His assistant told him, "New hire, 6 weeks in, former military, background somewhat vague, impressive clinical skills, already well-liked by the overnight staff." Victor nodded slowly. "Pull her full file." That was the moment. That quiet, deliberate request. That was the first stone rolling. Maya, meanwhile, was finishing her morning rounds with the kind of focused energy that made newer nurses both admire and slightly intimidate her. She was 38 years old and she moved through the floor the way certain people move through difficult rooms, with a particular quality of attention, like every corner of the space was already mapped in her mind. She wasn't cold. In fact, patients consistently used the word warm when they described her to their families. But there was something underneath the warmth, something that had been shaped by years of experience in environments where a wrong decision didn't just cause harm, it ended lives. Nobody at Crestview General knew what she had been before she became a nurse. The records were clean, the references were solid, the background check had returned nothing unusual. What lived in the classified files of a government database 3 states away was another matter entirely. But that was not Maya's problem today. Today her problem was Mr. Harold Briggs and a medication protocol that someone had deliberately tampered with. "Dr. Osai wants to see you," said Denise, one of the unit clerks, catching Maya near the medication room at 9:30. Denise was a heavy-set woman in her 50s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead and a maternal instinct that extended to every person within 20 feet of her. She lowered her voice slightly. She looked serious. "When doesn't she look serious?" Maya said and kept walking. Dr. Patricia Osei was one of the few people at Crestview General that Maya genuinely respected. Osei had been at the hospital for 19 years, had seen 3 CEOs come and go, had navigated every political current the institution had thrown at her, and had somehow managed to remain one of the best cardiologists in the region without compromising her standards. She was 61 years old, slight in build but enormous in presence. And when she looked at you over the rim of her glasses, you felt the weight of her entire career behind that look. She was standing at her desk when Maya knocked and entered. "Close the door," Osai said. Maya closed it. "I reviewed what you found." Osai picked up the folder. She didn't open it. She already knew what was in it. Harold Briggs's medication order was modified. The modification was logged under a billing admin code that shouldn't have access to clinical orders. "I know," Maya said. "I've seen this before," Osei said, and her voice had a particular quality now, something careful and weighted. "Not with this patient, with others. Over the past 18 months, there have been 7 patients in this ward whose care protocols were adjusted in ways that reduced their length of stay. 2 of them were readmitted within 30 days. One of them did not survive the readmission." The room went very quiet. Maya looked at the doctor steadily. "What happened when you reported it?" Osei set the folder down. "I reported it to the compliance office 14 months ago. I was told it was under review. I followed up 4 times. I was told it was still under review." She paused. 3 months ago, 2 members of the compliance team were let go in a restructuring. The review disappeared with them. "And you think Haldren knows?" Osei didn't answer right away. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Maya for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that you need to be very thoughtful about how you proceed from here." It was not a warning. It was not advice. It was something in between, and Maya heard exactly what it was. "Harold Briggs gets his medication adjustment today," Maya said. "Yes," Osei agreed. "He does. And the documentation goes in the official record." "Yes," Osei said again, and she finally turned back around. There was something in her eyes that looked like both admiration and fear in equal measure. "It does." Maya left the office and walked directly back to room 412. What she did not know was that Victor Haldren's assistant had already forwarded a summary of the morning's events to his personal email. What she did not know was that Victor had read it on his phone during a board meeting and had excused himself to make a call from the stairwell. What she did not know was that the call lasted 11 minutes and that the person on the other end of that call was not anyone whose name appeared on a hospital directory. Harold Briggs looked up when Maya came back into his room. He was a small man with white hair and careful eyes, the kind of man who had spent his whole life paying attention to other people and so noticed everything. "You're back," he said. "I told you I would be." Maya sat down and opened his chart. We're going to fix your medication this morning, Mr. Briggs. I need you to tell me how you've been feeling. Not the version you told the other doctors, the real version." Harold looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile. "My hands have been shaking," he said, "and I feel like I can't quite catch my breath. Like something is sitting on my chest that isn't quite heavy enough to hurt, but won't let me fully relax either." "How long?" "About 4 days. That's consistent with what I found in your labs," Maya wrote in the chart. "We're going to address this today. You're going to start feeling better by tomorrow morning." Harold nodded. Then he said quietly, "Thank you for calling my daughter back." Maya looked up. "That's my job." "No," Harold said gently. "That was more than your job. That was you choosing to care." Maya held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face that was too brief to fully read. Then she stood up, gave his hand a quick, matter-of-fact pat, and went back to work. She had no idea that she was already being watched. Victor Haldren reviewed her personnel file in full that afternoon. He read every page with the methodical attention of someone who was not reading to understand a person, but to find a weakness. He had done this before with others who had become inconvenient. A physical therapist 2 years ago who had started asking uncomfortable questions about equipment billing. A respiratory technician who had gone to the state health board. He had handled both situations cleanly and quietly, using a combination of performance reviews, schedule manipulation, and in the therapist's case, a well-placed accusation about patient record access that had resulted in a termination that looked entirely above board on paper. He had tools for this. He had people who helped him use those tools. The hospital board trusted him implicitly because under his leadership, revenue had increased by 42%. In the world that Victor Haldren lived in, numbers of that magnitude purchased a remarkable amount of tolerance. But Maya Kesler's file gave him pause. The military record was thin, unusually thin. A 4-year enlistment, honorable discharge, some commendation language that was vague to the point of being uninformative. No specific unit designation, no deployment record. A reference from a former commanding officer whose own record returned almost nothing in a standard search. Victor stared at that section of the file for a long time. Then he called his director of human resources into his office. "I want a performance review initiated for this nurse," he said, sliding the file across his desk. "I want it framed around documentation concerns and protocol adherence. I want it started this week." The HR director, a man named Gerald Finch, who had worked for Victor for 7 years and understood implicitly what was and was not a neutral administrative request, nodded without asking questions. "I'll have it on her supervisor's desk by Thursday." "Good." Victor folded his hands on his desk. "And Gerald, make sure the supervisor is Marcus Webb, not Dr. Osai." Marcus Webb was the nursing floor manager, a man who owed his current position to a promotion that Victor had engineered 2 years ago after the previous floor manager had retired. Marcus was not malicious by nature. He was simply someone who had learned that his professional comfort was directly tied to his alignment with the administration's priorities, and he had adjusted his behavior accordingly. Gerald Finch left the office. Victor turned to his window and looked out over the hospital grounds for a long moment. He was not a man who enjoyed conflict. He genuinely believed this about himself. He preferred clean resolutions. He preferred situations where problems simply ceased to exist before they became loud. Maya Kesler was going to need to become much quieter very quickly. He did not yet understand what he was dealing with. The performance review notice landed on Maya's supervisor's desk the following Thursday, exactly as Victor had arranged. Marcus Webb called her into his office that afternoon with the expression of a man who was uncomfortable but had decided that discomfort was a reasonable professional cost. "This is just a preliminary review," Marcus said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Routine stuff. Documentation timing. A couple of medication administration entries that the system flagged as slightly outside standard windows." Maya looked at the paper. She read it slowly and completely, the way someone reads something when they want to understand not just what it says, but what it means. When she finished, she set it back on his desk. "The medication timing flags are from the morning I intervened on Harold Briggs," she said. "The documentation window was off because I was correcting a previous error in the system, not making a new one. That distinction should be evident from the audit trail." "Right, of course, it's just, is this a formal corrective action?" Marcus blinked. "No, it's just a preliminary." "Then I'd like to respond in writing and attach the relevant audit log to my response. I'd also like to note that I'm going to copy Dr. Osei on my written response, since she was involved in the clinical decision that prompted the documentation." Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. "Is there anything else?" Maya asked. There wasn't. She walked out of his office and down the hall and did not change her expression or her pace, because she had been trained to understand that your face and your body were information, and information given freely to adversaries was a tactical error. She went to the break room, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stood at the counter for approximately 90 seconds before Denise came in looking for a granola bar. "You okay?" Denise asked, reading something in Maya's posture that most people would have missed. "Yep," Maya said. Denise looked at her for another moment. "You know Marcus only does things like that when he gets told to." "I know. And you know who tells him." "I know that too." Denise opened her granola bar and chewed thoughtfully. "You're not scared, are you?" Maya looked at her coffee. "Not particularly." "That's either very brave or very foolish," Denise said. "Probably both," Maya said, and almost smiled. That night, after her shift, Maya went home to her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building 6 blocks from the hospital. The apartment was neat in the way that spoke of habit rather than preference. Everything in its place, nothing decorative that wasn't also functional. She kept the blinds at a particular angle that allowed her to see the street below without being visible from outside. She had arranged the furniture so that the desk faced the door. These were not things she thought about consciously. They were simply how she lived. She sat at her desk with a cup of tea and opened her laptop and spent the next 2 hours documenting everything she knew, everything she had observed, and every piece of evidence she had been able to gather regarding the medication modifications on Harold Briggs's chart and the 6 other patients Dr. Osei had mentioned. She cross-referenced dates. She pulled the billing reclassification codes. She mapped the timeline of the compliance team's reports and their subsequent silencing. When she finished, she had 12 pages of clean, organized, carefully sourced documentation. She saved it in 3 different locations, one on her laptop, one on an encrypted external drive, one uploaded to a cloud account registered under a name that was not her own, connected to a phone number that was also not her own, accessed through a proxy that would have taken a moderately skilled investigator several days to trace. She had learned a long time ago that when you went up against something powerful, the first thing you protected was your evidence. Then she closed her laptop, washed her cup, and went to bed. 3 floors away, in a corner office on the administrative wing, Victor Haldren was on the phone with someone who went by a nickname that Maya would have recognized immediately from a different chapter of her life. He was explaining that the performance review approach might be insufficient, that this particular employee had responded in a way that was structured and deliberate, and that suggested she understood how institutional processes worked better than the average nurse would. "I need this handled differently," Victor said. "I need her gone, not transferred, gone." The voice on the other end asked a question. "I don't care how," Victor said. He meant it. And somewhere in the quiet of that hospital, in a building where people came every day hoping to be healed, something shifted. A decision was made in the dark that would ripple outward in ways that Victor Haldren, for all his calculation and all his resources, was completely unequipped to anticipate. Because he had looked at Maya Kesler's file and seen a thin military record, He had not understood what thin military records meant. He had not understood that the people whose service records say the least are very often the ones who did the most. He had not understood that he had just aimed himself at someone who had survived things that would end most people before breakfast. Someone who had been trained not just to endure danger, but to think clearly inside it, to move through it, to use it. He had looked at Maya Kesler and seen a nurse. He had no idea what was underneath. The awning caught her. That was the only reason Maya Kesler was still breathing. 7 stories of open air, and the last thing between her and the pavement was a faded green canvas awning over the hospital side entrance. The kind that nobody paid attention to, the kind that maintenance had been scheduled to replace for the past 3 months and hadn't gotten around to yet. It tore under her weight and dropped her the final 6 feet, but it absorbed enough of the fall that when she hit the ground, she hit it rolling, her body doing something that wasn't thinking, but was pure, trained reflex, distributing the impact, protecting her spine, her head tucking automatically the way it had been drilled into muscle memory in a place she was not supposed to talk about. She lay on the concrete for exactly 4 seconds. Then she got up. Her left shoulder was dislocated. She knew that immediately from the dead specific pain of it and the way her arm hung wrong. 2 ribs on her right side were either fractured or badly bruised, every breath a sharp negotiation. Her lip was split and bleeding freely down her chin. Her left knee had taken the final impact and was screaming at her, but when she put weight on it, it held. She stood in the shadows of the side entrance and breathed. Slow, measured, the way she had been taught to breathe when everything was on fire around her and falling apart was not an option. Nobody had seen her land. The side entrance was used primarily by maintenance staff, and it was just past 11 at night. The street was quiet. Above her, 7 stories up, the rooftop door had already closed. She had approximately 2 minutes before someone might come through that side entrance. She had less time than that to make a decision. She made it in about 15 seconds. She did not go back inside. She did not call 911. She did not stand under the nearest light and flag down a passing car. She moved, quickly and deliberately, keeping to the shadow line along the building's exterior. She made her way to the parking structure across the street, went up to the 2nd level where the security cameras had a known blind spot she had clocked on her 3rd day at the hospital, and sat down behind a concrete pillar. She reached up with her right hand, gripped the top of a support column, braced her left elbow against the pillar, and with a short, controlled motion that made the night go briefly white behind her eyes, she relocated her own shoulder. The sound it made was not something she would describe to anyone. She sat with her back against the concrete and gave herself 60 seconds. Just 60. She counted them. Her training had taught her that the first thing shock wanted to do was take your mind offline, and the only way to fight that was structure. Count, breathe, assess. Count, breathe, assess. 1. Her attacker was Victor Haldren, CEO of Crestview General Hospital, a man with institutional power, security access, and at least one person on his payroll who had helped him get her alone on that rooftop. 2. He believed she was dead. That was an advantage. That was, in fact, the only advantage she had right now, and she needed to protect it completely. 3. She had 12 pages of documentation on a cloud server that he did not know existed. 4. She had a dislocated shoulder that she had just relocated herself, 2 possibly fractured ribs, a bleeding lip, and a knee that was going to stiffen badly in the next 30 minutes. 5. She was alive. She stood up. The first thing she needed was a phone that was not registered to her. The second thing she needed was someone she could trust without any formal connection to the hospital. The third thing she needed was medical attention that would not create a record under her name at any facility Victor Haldren had any connection to. She had all 3 of those things within 12 blocks of where she was standing. Her name, when she was not Maya Kesler, registered nurse, when she was the other version of herself that lived in classified files in old operational memories, was something she did not use anymore. But the network of people attached to that other name did not disappear just because she had walked away from it. Certain relationships, certain loyalties, they were not the kind that expired. She pulled a prepaid phone from the inside pocket of her jacket. She always carried it. She had carried a secondary phone every day for 15 years, and the habit had never left her, even when the reason for it seemed distant. She dialed a number she had not dialed in 2 years. It rang 3 times. "Yeah?" said the voice on the other end. Male, flat, the kind of voice that had heard everything and registered nothing as surprising. "It's me," Maya said. A pause, not a long one. "You okay?" "No, I need the package protocol." Another pause, slightly longer. "How bad?" "Shoulders back in. Ribs are a problem. I need a clean location." 40 minutes, the voice said. 25, Maya said. 25, the voice agreed, and the call ended. She moved. Upstairs in the executive wing of Crestview General, Victor Haldren was pouring 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass that cost more than most of his nurses made in a day. His hands were steady. He was proud of that. He set the bottle down and sat in his chair and allowed himself, for the first time since the rooftop, to fully exhale. It was done. He had spent the past 40 minutes going through the mental checklist of everything he had arranged. The rooftop access had been handled through a maintenance override logged under a routine HVAC inspection. The security camera covering the northeast corner of the roof had been in a documented service gap since Tuesday, a scheduling coincidence that was not, in fact, a coincidence at all. He had been alone with her. He had been careful. He had made certain that the conversation before the fall had been brief enough and private enough that there was nothing to analyze, nothing to reconstruct. She had come to the roof because she had received a message through the hospital's internal system from what appeared to be Dr. Osei's account, asking her to meet urgently. That message had been sent from a workstation in the records room during a window when 3 different staff members could theoretically have accessed it. None of them had, but the ambiguity was the point. Victor picked up his glass. He had thought of everything. He allowed himself one small moment of something that felt almost like relief. Then his personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then something made him pick it up. Haldren. Silence on the other end. Just breathing. Steady, unhurried breathing. "Hello?" he said. The breathing continued for another 3 seconds. Then the call disconnected. Victor stared at the phone. It was probably nothing. A misdial. He set it face down on the desk and finished his bourbon. But he did not sleep that night. Maya reached the address in 23 minutes. It was the back entrance of a physical therapy clinic that had been closed since 8 that evening. The door opened before she knocked, which told her the person inside had been watching the street, which told her everything she needed to know about whether she'd reached the right person. His name was Danny Reeves, and he was 54 years old, and he had once pulled her out of a burning vehicle on the other side of the world under conditions that neither of them would ever discuss in any room that wasn't completely secure. He was now a licensed physical therapist in a city that had no idea who he used to be, and the look on his face when he saw the state of her was the closest thing to open emotion she had ever seen from him. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. "I'm not going to fall down." "Sit down anyway." She sat. He was not a doctor, but he had more practical trauma experience than most emergency room residents. And for the next 20 minutes, he worked in focused silence while she sat on the treatment table and let him. He confirmed the ribs, 2 fractured on the right side, taped them with the efficiency of someone who had done this in far worse conditions. He checked her shoulder, checked her knee, examined her pupils, made her track his finger left and right. "You fell 7 floors, he said. It was not a question. The awning helped. "The awning," he repeated. "It was scheduled for replacement." Danny looked at her for a moment. And the person who pushed you still thinks I'm dead. Danny nodded slowly. He finished taping her ribs and stepped back. And what are you planning to do with that? Maya looked at him steadily. Everything. He handed her a bottle of water and a small case of medical supplies. You need a hospital. Not tonight. Maya. Danny, not tonight. She met his eyes. I have one window. If he finds out I'm alive before I'm ready, that window closes. You know how this works. He did know. He hated it, but he knew. He sat down across from her and crossed his arms. Tell me what you need. She told him. It took about 8 minutes. When she finished, Danny was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of it. The medication tampering, the compliance reports that had been buried, the patient who had not survived, the documents she had prepared, the call she needed to make, and to whom, and how it needed to be framed. You've been building this case, he said, for 3 weeks, before he came after you. Yes. So you already knew it was going to go sideways. Maya took a slow breath, the taped ribs making it a careful exercise. I knew what kind of man he was the moment I read Harold Briggs's chart. I've met people like Haldren before, not in hospitals, but the same architecture. They don't stop when you push back, they escalate. So you prepare for the escalation before it comes. Danny was quiet again. Then he said, very quietly, and if the awning hadn't been there? She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The call, she said, I need to make the call tonight. It was 12:47 in the morning when Maya used Danny's landline to dial a number that connected to a federal tip line that most people didn't know existed, and that was monitored around the clock by people whose job title did not appear on any public government directory. She had used this line once before, a long time ago, in a completely different context, and the protocol was the same. You stated a classification code. You gave a name and an institution. You provided a preliminary evidence summary, and then you waited. She did all 3 of those things in under 4 minutes. When she hung up, Danny was watching her from across the room. Now what? He asked. Now I go back to work, Maya said. He stared at her. You can't be serious. If I disappear, he knows I'm alive. If I show up for my shift tomorrow morning like nothing happened, he spends the next 24 hours convinced he got away with it. That 24 hours is exactly what I need. You have 2 fractured ribs. I've worked with worse. Maya, Danny, her voice was not harsh. It was simply final. The voice of someone who had made their calculation and was not revisiting it. I need you to trust me on this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head, the small, exhausted headshake of someone who knew they weren't going to win the argument. At least let me drive you. She let him drive her. She was back in her apartment by 2:15 in the morning. She showered, changed, took 2 of the prescription-strength anti-inflammatories Danny had pressed into her hand, and set her alarm for 5:30. Then she lay down on her bed, closed her eyes, and did not think about how close the concrete had been. She did not think about Victor Haldren's face in the moment before the fall. She did not think about the 7 floors of dark air. She thought methodically and clearly about the 12 pages of documentation and what came next, and how each step needed to unfold and in what order. Then she slept. 4 hours and 11 minutes later, her alarm went off and Maya Kesler got out of bed, got dressed, and went back to Crestview General. She arrived at 6:48, 13 minutes before her scheduled shift. She walked through the main entrance with her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her left arm moving naturally despite the effort that required, her face carrying exactly the same expression it always carried. She nodded to the overnight security guard. She stopped at the nurse's station to pick up her patient assignment sheets. She poured coffee from the break room. She was at Harold Briggs's door by 7. He was awake. He had been awake for a while, she could tell, the restless early waking of someone whose body was still recalibrating. But when he saw her, something in his face relaxed, the way it always relaxed when a person who has been worried sees the exact right person walk through the door. "You're here," he said, and his voice had something in it that made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the fractured ribs. "I'm here," she said, and checked his monitor. His numbers were already better. The medication adjustment was working exactly as it should have. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Harold thought about it honestly, the way he always answered her questions. "Like something lifted," he said. "Like the thing that was sitting on my chest decided to go bother someone else." "That's the potassium," she said and made a note. "Your body was working too hard to compensate. Now it doesn't have to." Harold watched her write. "You look tired," he said. "Long night. Everything all right?" She looked up at him. Harold Briggs, 73 years old, retired postal worker, a man who had spent his whole life paying attention to other people. She gave him the version of a smile that was real but small. "Getting there," she said. She finished her notes and moved to her next patient. She worked the entire morning. She checked charts, administered medications, spoke with 3 different families, flagged a potential drug interaction on a post-surgical patient in 418 that the attending physician confirmed and corrected within the hour. She did her job. She did it well. She did it with the same unhurried precision she always brought to the floor, except that every 30 minutes she excused herself to the supply room and spent 90 seconds doing a controlled breathing exercise because the fractured ribs made sustained movement expensive, and she was managing the cost very carefully. At 9:15, Victor Haldren arrived on the floor. This was not entirely unusual. He did occasional administrative walkthroughs, the kind that were more performance than substance, designed to maintain his image as a hands-on leader. But the timing of this one, the morning after, and the particular direction of his walk, brought him past the nurse's station and past the corridor that led to Harold Briggs's room and toward the bank of elevators near the medication room. He walked past Maya without looking at her. Then he stopped. He turned around slowly. She was standing at the medication cart with her back to him, entering an order into the system. Her posture was even. Her movements were unhurried. She looked, to anyone watching, like exactly what she appeared to be, a nurse on a Tuesday morning doing her job. Victor Haldren's entire body went rigid. The blood left his face so completely that Denise, who was walking past with a stack of folders and happened to glance up, later told her friend at lunch that the CEO had looked like someone had unplugged him. "Like somebody pulled a wire right out of the back of his neck," she said. "He went white as a sheet and just stood there." Victor recovered in approximately 3 seconds. He was a man accustomed to controlling his exterior presentation, but 3 seconds was long enough for something cold and structural to move through him. The specific terror of someone who has done the irreversible thing and is now watching it walk around in scrubs. She was alive. She was here. She was acting like nothing had happened. His mind went immediately to the question of why, and the answer that came back to him was not reassuring. She wasn't reporting it. She wasn't confronting him. She wasn't doing either of the things a normal person would do, which meant she was doing something else entirely, something calculated, and the fact that he couldn't see what it was yet was the most frightening thing he had encountered in 11 years of running this hospital. He needed to think. He needed to get somewhere quiet and think, and then he needed to make a call, and he needed to do both of those things immediately. He turned and walked back to the elevator without a word. Maya did not turn around. She had heard him stop. She had heard the precise quality of his stillness, the way it was different from normal stillness, heavier and more sudden, and she had counted his 3 seconds of recovery and his footsteps retreating to the elevator. She had not turned around because turning around would have told him something, and she was not ready to give him anything yet. She continued entering the medication order. Her hands did not shake, but her heart was hammering, not with fear, with something more complex than fear. The recognition that the game had begun, that he now knew she was alive, and that she knew he knew, and that the clock had just started running in a very different way. She finished the order. She closed the cart. She walked to the break room, poured herself a second cup of coffee she didn't need, and took out her personal phone. She sent a single text message to a number that was not in her contacts under any name. The message contained 4 words and a number. It said, "He just saw me." 12 seconds later, the reply came back. Timeline moved up. Confirmed. Maya put her phone in her pocket and drank her coffee and looked at the wall and thought about Harold Briggs telling her that something had lifted off his chest. She thought about the 6 other patients. She thought about the compliance officer whose investigation had been buried. She thought about the person who had not survived the readmission. She thought about Victor Haldren's face when he had looked at her across that rooftop the night before, the absolute absence of doubt in his eyes, the certainty that she was a problem he was solving. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. Victor, meanwhile, was in his car in the parking structure, his tie loosened for the first time anyone could remember seeing, his phone to his ear, and his voice doing something it almost never did. It was shaking. "She's alive," he said. "She's standing on the 4th floor right now, acting like nothing happened. She didn't go to the police. She didn't call anyone. She's here." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then it said something that made Victor go even stiller than he already was. "She's not just a nurse," the voice said. "I looked deeper into her file last night after you called. That military record, the gaps in it, I know what those gaps mean." "What do you mean, what they mean?" Another pause. "Victor, the people whose records look like hers, they don't go to the police. They handle things themselves. And if she's back at that hospital this morning, acting calm, it's not because she doesn't know what to do. It's because she already did it." Victor's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. "Then we need to move," he said. "Right now. Today." "Moving right now is exactly what she's waiting for you to do," the voice said. The silence that followed was the longest of Victor Haldren's professional life. And somewhere on the 4th floor, Maya Kesler clocked the time, noted that Victor's car had been in the parking structure for 11 minutes, and began the quiet, careful work of being ready for whatever he decided to do next. Victor Haldren spent exactly 14 minutes in that parking structure before he made the decision that would seal his fate. Not because it was the right decision, because it was the only one a man like him knew how to make. When cornered, Victor didn't retreat. He doubled down. 11 years of running Crestview General had taught him that aggression dressed up as confidence was almost always mistaken for strength, and that people who looked like they were in control usually were, as long as nobody looked too closely. He made 2 calls before he went back inside. The first call lasted 3 minutes. The second lasted 7. When he walked back through the main entrance of the hospital, his tie was straight again, and his face had settled back into the composed executive mask that the board of directors had trusted for over a decade. But his eyes were different now. Anyone who knew how to read people, and Maya Kesler knew how to read people better than almost anyone alive, would have seen it immediately. The calculation behind them had shifted. He wasn't managing anymore. He was hunting. It was 9:44 in the morning. Maya was in room 418, reviewing the post-surgical patient's updated chart, when Denise appeared in the doorway and gave her the look. Not a full expression, just a slight widening of the eyes and a tilt of the head that said, "Come find me when you're done, and don't make it obvious." Maya finished her notes, said something brief and reassuring to the patient, and followed Denise to the linen supply room 2 minutes later. Denise closed the door behind them both and turned around with her arms folded across her chest. "Gerald Finch just walked onto this floor," she said. "HR director. He went straight to Marcus Webb's office. The door is closed." Maya processed that in about 2 seconds. "How long ago?" 5 minutes, maybe 6. "Did you see what Finch was carrying?" "A folder, thin one, and his laptop." Maya looked at the shelf of neatly stacked towels across from her and thought for a moment. HR director. thin folder, closed door with the floor manager, coming directly after Victor had seen her on the floor, coming less than an hour after she had watched Victor walk to the elevator with the color gone from his face. This was the next move. She had anticipated a version of it, but the speed was faster than she had expected, which told her one thing very clearly. Victor was scared, and scared men in positions of power did not get careful. They got fast. "Denise," she said, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it naturally, like it's completely routine." Denise looked at her with the steady, unimpressed expression of a woman who had seen enough hospital drama in 30 years of floor work to last several lifetimes. "All right, go to the nurses' station and pull my last 2 weeks of documentation logs. Print them. Put them in the routine audit binder that lives in the second drawer. Don't make it look like you're doing it for any specific reason." Denise nodded once. "And if someone asks, routine quality check. You do them every month." "I do them every month." "I know," Maya said. "That's why I'm asking you." Denise looked at her for one more second, and in that second, something passed between them that was more than professional. A particular understanding between two women who had each spent their careers in a place that didn't always protect the people trying hardest to do the right thing. Then Denise opened the door and walked out with the unhurried purpose of someone who had somewhere ordinary to be. Maya gave it 90 seconds and then walked back to the floor. She was charting at the nurse's station when Marcus Webb's office door opened at 10:12. Gerald Finch came out first, then Marcus, and Marcus had an expression on his face that Maya recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who had just been handed something he didn't entirely want to be holding. Marcus caught her eye. He looked away first. Gerald Finch did not look at her at all, which was somehow worse, the deliberate non-look of a man executing a task and not making it personal. They went to the elevator together. Maya watched them go and then went back to her chart and finished the entries she had been working on with the same steady handwriting she always used. 12 minutes later, Marcus came back alone. He stood at the edge of the nurse's station for a moment, and Maya could see him working up to something, the way people do when they know the thing they're about to say is wrong and are trying to find a way to say it that makes it feel less wrong. "Maya, my office when you have a minute." "I have one now," she said and stood up. They walked to his office. He closed the door. He sat down. She did not sit, and he noticed that she didn't sit, and she could see that it made him less comfortable, which was precisely why she remained standing. "This is very awkward," Marcus started. "It usually is," she said. He put a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "I've been asked to place you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a formal investigation into documentation irregularities and potential access violations in the patient record system." Maya looked at the paper. She read it fully, not rushing, even though she had expected almost exactly this. The language was clean and carefully vague. Documentation irregularities, potential access violations. Nothing specific enough to be easily rebutted. Nothing concrete enough to constitute a genuine charge. It was the institutional equivalent of a tripwire, designed not to stop her, but to slow her down, to pull her off the floor and away from patients and out of the building while Victor figured out what she had and how much damage she could do. She looked up from the paper. "I want to note for the record," she said quietly, "that this action is being taken less than 60 minutes after the CEO walked past me on this floor and appeared visibly distressed to find me here. I also want to note that I am going to be requesting the full documentation trail for this administrative leave order, including who initiated it, what specific records triggered it, and when that trigger was logged in the system." Marcus was very still. "I'm going to put all of that in writing," she continued, "and I'm going to copy Dr. Osei, the state nursing board, and the hospital's patient safety compliance officer on that written request. Do you understand?" Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I'll clean out my locker," Maya said. She walked out of his office. Her ribs were on fire from the sustained tension of holding herself upright and controlled through all of that. But she walked with exactly the same pace she always walked with, and she did not let a single thing show on her face. At 10:29, Maya Kesler left Crestview General through the main entrance. She did not look up at the security cameras on her way out, but she knew exactly where each of them was, and she knew that her exit was being recorded, and she wanted it recorded. She wanted a timestamp. She wanted documentation of the exact moment Victor Haldren had removed her from the building. She wanted all of it on record. She was 3 blocks away when her phone buzzed. A message from the number she had texted that morning. It said, "Package received and opened. 2 additional sources confirmed. Move to phase 2. Maya read it twice, then she put her phone in her pocket and kept walking. What Victor did not know, what he could not have known from the incomplete picture he was working with, was that the 12 pages of documentation Maya had uploaded to the encrypted cloud server were not the full extent of what she had prepared. They were the beginning. The 12 pages were the scaffolding, the framework that pointed to the larger structure. What filled that larger structure was something she had been quietly building since her second week at Crestview General, when she had first started to understand the shape of what Victor was doing and had begun systematically and without drawing any attention to the process to gather the pieces. She had made copies of 6 different patients' complete billing and care records, cross-referencing them against the insurance reimbursement logs that a billing analyst named Carol Huang had inadvertently given her access to during a routine process walkthrough in Maya's first week. Carol had been showing her how to navigate the hospital's administrative system and had logged in under her own credentials to demonstrate the billing module without thinking twice about the fact that Maya was watching and absorbing every keystroke. Maya had not exploited that access improperly. She had not gone into any system she wasn't authorized to view, but she had understood from that demonstration exactly where the records lived and what they contained and how the modification trail would look if someone knew what to look for. She had known what to look for. The federal tip line call she had made in the middle of the night had not been her only contact. It had been the first domino. The second had been an email sent at 3:40 in the morning from Danny's secure laptop to a journalist at a regional investigative outlet who had published 2 pieces in the past 4 years about insurance fraud in mid-size hospital systems and who had a source protection record that was essentially spotless. The email contained a summary document with 3 attached exhibits and a contact protocol for secure follow-up. The third domino was more personal. Dr. Patricia Osei had arrived at her office that morning at 7:15 to find an envelope slipped under her door. Not in the hospital's internal mail system, a physical envelope, sealed, left sometime between 6 and 7. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 paragraphs, unsigned, but Osei knew the handwriting. She had seen it on a note left under her door 3 weeks earlier, the first time Maya had flagged the Harold Briggs situation. The note said 2 things. First, that what Osei had reported to the compliance office 14 months ago was now in the hands of people with both the authority and the motivation to act on it. Second, that when the time came, and it was coming soon, Osei's own documentation of those previous reports would matter enormously, and that she should make sure it was somewhere safe. Osei had read the note once, then a second time, then she had sat down in her chair and held it in both hands and looked out her window for a very long time. She was thinking about the patient who had not survived the readmission. She was thinking about the 4 times she had followed up with the compliance office and received nothing. She was thinking about 19 years at this institution and about the version of herself who had gone into medicine because she wanted to matter, and about whether she had been mattering or just enduring. She opened her desk drawer. She took out the folder she had kept in the back of that drawer for 14 months, the one she had never thrown away even when the compliance review disappeared, even when the silence from the administration became so loud it was almost a sound. She took it out and she put it in her bag. and she made a call of her own. It was 11:15. Victor was in a board meeting that he had called under the pretense of a routine budget update. In reality, he had needed to get all 7 of his most powerful board allies in one room, where he could read their faces and determine how much, if anything, they knew. The meeting was going smoothly. The board was asking the kinds of questions they always asked: financial performance questions, strategic vision questions, the comfortable language of people who had no reason to look beneath the surface of what they were being presented. Then board member Elaine Mortimer, a sharp 70-year-old former hospital administrator who had joined the board 3 years ago and who Victor had always privately considered the most dangerous mind in that room, said something that made him feel the floor move under his feet. "I'd like to add something to the agenda," Elaine said, "if you don't mind." Victor kept his expression neutral. "Of course. I received a call this morning from a contact at the State Health Oversight Office. Apparently, there's been a preliminary inquiry opened regarding Crestview's patient care protocols over the past 18 months. The contact was being courteous by giving me advance notice." She paused. "I'd like to know if you have any awareness of this, Victor." The room had gone very quiet. Every single person at that table was looking at him. Victor Haldren had been performing under pressure for 11 years. He was good at it. He produced a measured, slightly puzzled expression that communicated both surprise and calm confidence. "I haven't been notified of any formal inquiry," he said. "If a preliminary contact has been made, I would expect our compliance office to receive something official in the normal course. I'll look into it this afternoon." Elaine Mortimer looked at him for exactly 3 seconds without speaking. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, but she did not look away from him for the rest of the meeting. Victor held himself together through 30 more minutes of budget discussion, and then excused himself and walked to the men's room at the end of the executive corridor, and stood over the sink with the tap running cold and gripped the sides of the basin and breathed. State Health Oversight. Preliminary inquiry. The timeline was wrong. It was moving too fast. He had expected days, maybe a week if she went to any authority at all, had expected the slow, institutional grind of complaints and investigations that usually took months to generate any real momentum. Not this. Not a board member receiving a courtesy call the morning after. He straightened up. He looked at himself in the mirror. Then he took out his phone and dialed the number he had called that morning from the parking structure. It went to voicemail. He dialed again. Voicemail again. He stood very still in the executive bathroom with cold water still running from the tap, and understood, for the first time with his whole body rather than just his rational mind, that something had gotten away from him. What he did not yet know was that the person he was trying to reach had received a visit at his own office 90 minutes earlier from 2 individuals who were not law enforcement in any official capacity that could be easily named, but who carried credentials that made the distinction largely academic. That person was currently in a conference room down the hall from his own office, answering questions with the careful, measured dishonesty of someone who had not yet decided whether to cooperate or stonewall, and was buying time by doing neither fully. He would make up his mind within the next 3 hours, but not in Victor's favor. Maya was sitting in Danny Reeves's clinic, which did not open to the public until noon on Wednesdays, at a small table with a cup of tea and her personal laptop. Her ribs had settled into a deep, persistent ache that she had organized in her mind as background noise. She was reading through a document that had just been shared with her through a secure link. A preliminary summary of what the federal contact had confirmed was already in hand. It was more than she had hoped. The billing manipulation trail was cleaner than she had realized from her own research. The administrative coding changes that had affected patient care protocols were directly linked to a vendor contract that Crestview General had signed 16 months ago. A contract that Victor had personally negotiated and that contained a performance incentive structure that rewarded the hospital financially for reduced length of stay outcomes in 3 specific diagnostic categories. The contract itself was not illegal, but the way it had been implemented, the way patient care decisions had been quietly restructured to serve the contract's metrics rather than clinical best practice, crossed a line that multiple federal statutes cared about very directly. And there was something else, something Maya had not known. 2 of the 6 patients she had identified were Medicare patients, federal patients. That changed the jurisdictional picture entirely. She read that line twice. Then she sat back carefully, protecting her ribs, and let the full weight of it settle. Medicare fraud, not hospital administrative misconduct, not an internal compliance issue. Federal fraud, the kind that did not move slowly, the kind that did not disappear into a committee review, the kind that brought people with federal badges to your door on a timeline entirely outside your control. She thought about Victor Haldren standing in that parking structure this morning, talking to whoever was on the other end of his phone. She thought about the expression on his face when he had walked past her on the floor and seen her standing there, breathing and alive. She thought about the way he had straightened his tie before pushing her off a rooftop, like the tidiness of his appearance was the thing that mattered in that moment. She thought about Harold Briggs saying something lifted. She thought about the patient who hadn't survived. Her phone buzzed on the table, a number she recognized from the investigative journalist she had contacted. She picked up. "I got your package," the voice on the other end said. A woman, mid-40s, the brisk, efficient cadence of someone who worked with information the way other people worked with their hands. "I've been working on Crestview for 8 months already. I didn't have what you just sent me." "I know," Maya said. "I want to talk to you on record." "Not yet," Maya said. "I need 48 hours. "I need 24. 48, Maya said. "The federal piece needs to move first. If your story runs before they've made contact with the board, Haldren has time to get ahead of it. The story has to land after the investigation is already visible." A pause on the other end. The journalist was thinking. Maya could almost hear the calculation happening. 48 hours, the journalist said finally. "But I'm filing on hour 49 whether you're ready or not." "That's fine," Maya said. She hung up. Danny came in from the back carrying a brown paper bag that turned out to contain 2 sandwiches and an expression that said he had been listening to at least part of that conversation. "You're running this whole thing yourself," he said. "I have help. You're coordinating federal investigators, a journalist, and a cardiologist with 2 fractured ribs from a physical therapy clinic less than 12 hours after someone threw you off a building." He set the sandwiches on the table. "You know that's not normal." "I know," she said. "Does it feel normal to you?" She picked up half a sandwich. "It feels like the right sequence of steps." Danny sat down across from her and shook his head the way he had been shaking his head at her for going on 15 years. "You could have just called 911 last night and watched him retain 4 lawyers, claim it was a misunderstanding, and use his compliance team to bury the patient records while his board rallied around him." She looked at Danny across the table. "You know better than that." He did know better than that. He hated that he knew better than that. He picked up his own sandwich and ate in silence for a moment. "What happens when he figures out the 48-hour window?" he asked. "He already knows something is moving. He just doesn't know how far or how fast." "And if he runs?" Maya thought about Victor Haldren. She thought about his leather chair and his bourbon, and the way he had straightened his tie. She thought about a man who had spent 11 years building something, a position, an identity, a version of himself that the world reflected back to him as important and untouchable. Men like that did not run. Running required accepting that what you had built was over. Victor Haldren was not capable of that acceptance yet. "He won't run," she said. "He'll fight. He'll call the board. He'll try to get ahead of it. He'll file something against me, harassment, false reporting, whatever his lawyers can put together fastest." She took a breath that cost her. "He'll keep moving because stopping means admitting it's over, and he can't do that." So he'll make more mistakes. Yes, Maya said simply. Outside the clinic, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday in complete ignorance of the machinery turning inside it. Patients arrived at Crestview General and were admitted and treated. The board members returned to their offices and their phones and their ordinary concerns. Marcus Webb sat at his desk on the fourth floor and stared at his door and thought about things he had not let himself think about in a long time. Denise finished her documentation audit and put the binder in the second drawer where it had always lived, and went back to the nurse's station and answered the phone the way she always did. And Harold Briggs, in room 412, called his daughter and told her that his chest felt better, that the thing sitting on it had finally moved, that the nurse who had helped him was something else, not ordinary, something else entirely. His daughter asked what her name was. Maya, Harold said. Her name is Maya, and 41 blocks away, in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and institutional carpet, the man Victor Haldren had been trying to reach for the past 2 hours leaned forward across the table and said 4 words to the 2 people sitting across from him. "I'll tell you everything." The man who said those 4 words was named Russell Greer, and he had been Victor Haldren's outside financial consultant for 9 years. He was 51 years old, moderately successful by the standards of his profession, and he had spent nearly a decade telling himself that what he was helping Victor do was aggressive but legal, creative but defensible, the kind of thing that sharp people in institutional finance did all the time and that nobody looked at too hard as long as the numbers kept moving in the right direction. He had a daughter in college and a mortgage in a good neighborhood and a very specific understanding of how much trouble he was currently sitting across the table from. He told them everything in 2 hours and 20 minutes. He talked about the vendor contract and the incentive structure and the way the billing codes had been designed to look like administrative reclassifications when they were in fact deliberate alterations to patient care triggers. He talked about the 2 compliance officers who had been let go and the reason they had been let go and who had made that call. He talked about a meeting 14 months ago in Victor's office where the phrase patient throughput optimization had been used 17 times and the phrase patient outcomes had been used 0 times. He talked about emails. He had kept the emails. He had kept them in a personal archive on a server that Victor did not own and could not access. Because Russell Greer had spent 9 years helping a man do questionable things, and some part of him, the part that had a daughter in college and a conscience that had never fully gone to sleep, had always known that this day might come. He gave them the archive location and the access credentials without being asked twice. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 federal investigators had more documentation than they needed to open a formal case. By 2:30, they had enough to make calls to 3 additional agencies. By 3, those agencies were making calls of their own. Victor Haldren did not know any of this yet, but he could feel it. The way certain people can feel a change in atmospheric pressure before the weather breaks, the way the air gets a particular quality that your body registers before your mind can name it. He had been feeling it since 11 that morning, since he had stood in the executive bathroom with cold water running and looked at himself in the mirror. And the feeling had been getting heavier and more specific with every passing hour. He had tried to reach Russell 4 more times since noon. Nothing. He had spoken to his personal attorney at 1:15, a careful conversation in which he had not said anything specific, but had communicated enough that the attorney had told him, in the measured language of someone choosing every syllable, to do nothing, contact no one, and wait for further guidance. Victor had agreed and then immediately done the opposite of all 3 things. At 2:47, he called Elaine Mortimer. This was the decision that surprised even the people who had been watching him. Not because calling a board member was inherently surprising, but because Elaine Mortimer was the last person on that board Victor should have been calling. She was too sharp. She had already asked the question in the meeting that morning. Calling her now was the kind of move a desperate man made when his normally excellent instincts had been overridden by panic. Elaine picked up on the second ring. "Victor," she said. Her voice was neutral in the way that only very experienced people can make neutral sounds simultaneously warm and completely unrevealing. "Elaine, I wanted to follow up on what you raised in the meeting this morning about the state inquiry." "Of course. I've been doing some digging this afternoon, and I want to be transparent with you. There may be some documentation issues in our billing records from the past 18 months that could draw some scrutiny. Nothing that wasn't addressed in good faith, but the kind of thing that looks messy if someone is looking for messy." A pause. 2 seconds. 3. "I see," Elaine said. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly, before anything official comes through, because I value your judgment on the board, and I think the framing of this situation is going to matter." Another pause, longer this time. "Victor," Elaine said slowly, "are you asking me to help you frame something?" He heard the shift in her voice and adjusted immediately. No, I'm asking for your counsel as a senior board member on how best to communicate a complicated administrative situation to—" "I'm going to stop you there," Elaine said, and her voice had completely changed now. The neutral warmth was gone. What was underneath it was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years in healthcare administration and had seen every variety of institutional self-protection and had no patience left for any of it. "I'm going to stop you, and I'm going to tell you that I received a second call this afternoon, not from the state office this time, from a federal contact. And I'm going to tell you that whatever you were about to ask me to do, I am not going to do it. And I am going to tell you that you should call your attorney and stop talking to everyone else. Right now, that's my counsel." She hung up. Victor sat with his phone in his hand for a full 30 seconds. His office felt different than it had yesterday. The same furniture, the same window, the same view, but the dimensions of it felt altered, like the walls had moved slightly inward while he wasn't watching. "Federal," she had said, "federal." He stood up. He walked to his window. He pressed one hand flat against the glass and looked out at the parking structure across the street and thought about the morning. About standing in that structure with the phone to his ear. About the moment he had said, "I don't care how." He thought about 11 years. He thought about 42% revenue growth. He thought about the board members who had stood beside him at galas and nodded approvingly at every quarterly report, who had called him visionary, who had given him the authority and the latitude to do what he had done because the numbers were good, and the numbers were what they understood. He thought about Maya Kesler standing at the medication cart this morning with her back to him, completely calm, completely composed, every movement ordinary and unhurried, as if the previous night had not happened. He thought about how long she had been standing there before he walked past, how long she had been on that floor, doing her work, being seen, creating a record of her own presence. He understood then, fully and completely, and in a way that landed in his stomach like something physical, that she had not come back to the hospital this morning out of stubbornness or shock or an inability to process what had happened to her. She had come back because it was tactically necessary, because she needed him to see her and react and set the administrative leave in motion so that the timestamp of his reaction would become part of the evidentiary record. Because she had needed him to make the next move so she could document it. He had been managed. From the moment she had walked through the main entrance that morning, he had been managed. His phone rang. His attorney. He picked it up. "Don't say anything," the attorney said immediately, in a tone that meant things had changed since their 1:15 conversation. "Just listen. I've been contacted by a colleague who has been approached by federal investigators regarding Crestview General. The inquiry is formally open as of this afternoon. I need you to come to my office. Right now. Not in an hour. Right now." Victor said nothing. "Victor, are you listening to me?" "I'm listening," Victor said. "Come to my office." "Yes," Victor said. He put on his coat. He picked up his briefcase. He walked out of his office and past his assistant's desk and down the corridor toward the elevator. And on the way, he passed the framed photograph that had hung outside his office for 8 years. The one taken at the ribbon cutting for the hospital's new cardiac wing, his face broad and confident in the center of the frame, the board flanking him on both sides, everyone smiling. He did not look at it. It was 3:18 in the afternoon. Maya was back in her apartment. She had come home from Danny's clinic at 2, had taken the prescribed anti-inflammatories, had lain down for 45 minutes, not entirely by choice, because her body had finally started presenting a bill for everything she had asked of it in the past 18 hours. She had not fully slept. She had rested in the way that trained people rest, alert but still, giving her body what it needed while her mind continued its slow, organized inventory of the moving pieces. Her phone had been active for most of those 45 minutes, not ringing, but receiving. Messages from the number she had been coordinating with since the night before. Updates arriving in short, factual bursts that she read and filed and did not respond to unless a response was needed. The update at 2:52 made her sit up. Russell Greer had cooperated. Full cooperation. The email archive. She read that one twice. She had not known about Russell Greer's archive. She had known he existed. She had found his name in the vendor contract documentation and had flagged him as a person of interest in her notes. Someone who would likely have information, but whose cooperation she had assessed as uncertain. The archive changed the picture dramatically. Her 12 pages of documentation had been the trigger. Russell Greer's emails were the loaded weapon. She got up. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter, and pressed both hands flat on the cold surface, and let herself feel, for the first time since she had walked off that rooftop the previous night, something adjacent to relief. Not relief itself, not yet, but the edge of it. Then her personal phone rang. The number was Dr. Patricia Osei. She picked up. Dr. Osei, are you safe? Osei's voice was low and careful, and carried something in it that Maya had not heard from her before. Urgency that was not quite fear, but was close to it. I'm fine. I heard about the administrative leave. A pause. I also heard that you left the building this morning without any apparent distress, which I have been thinking about ever since. I'm okay, Dr. Osei, genuinely. Another pause, longer. I found the envelope under my door this morning. Maya said nothing. I have the folder in my bag, Osei said. The one I've kept for 14 months. I called the number on the envelope. I spoke with someone for 22 minutes this afternoon. Her voice tightened slightly. Maya, they already knew most of what I told them. They had documentation I didn't even know existed. I know. You built this case before he came after you. Yes. So when he pushed you off that roof, Osei stopped. The sentence sat unfinished between them for a moment, and the weight of what it contained was enormous. He had no idea what he was destroying. He thought he was ending a problem, Maya said. He didn't understand what the problem actually was. Osei was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, steadier, the voice of a woman who had made a decision and moved to the other side of it. What do you need from me? Your testimony, your reports, the documentation of your 4 follow-ups with compliance, the dates, everything exactly as you recorded it. Maya paused. And I need you to know that what you're doing matters, not just for this case, for the patients, for the one we didn't save. The silence on Osei's end lasted long enough that Maya thought the call might have dropped. Then Osei said, very quietly, I think about her every day. I know, Maya said. Me too. And I didn't even know her. They stayed on the line together for another few seconds without speaking. 2 women in different rooms in the same city, carrying the same particular weight of what it meant to have tried and not been enough, and to be trying again anyway. I'll have everything compiled by tomorrow morning, Osei said. Thank you, Dr. Osei. Patricia, she said. I think at this point you can call me Patricia. Maya almost smiled. Thank you, Patricia. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and gave herself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not quite emotion, but lived in the same neighborhood. Then she moved. She had 41 hours left of her 48-hour window, and there was still work to do. At 4:15, Marcus Webb did something that nobody at Crestview General would have predicted, least of all Marcus himself. He walked out of his office, went to the fourth-floor utility room that housed the backup server terminal, logged in with his own credentials, and printed a complete administrative activity log for the past 6 weeks. Every access, every modification, every login, including the entries that showed billing admin codes touching clinical records they had no legitimate reason to touch, including the modification trail on Harold Briggs's chart, including the access log for Dr. Osei's credentials on the night the fake message had been sent to Maya's internal account to get her onto that rooftop. He held the printed log in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. He thought about the performance review he had been told to initiate. He thought about the administrative leave he had delivered this morning with the expression of a man who knew he was doing something wrong and was doing it anyway. He thought about 7 years of small compromises and the way each one had made the next one easier, and the way he had told himself each time that it was just how things worked, that he was being practical, that nobody got anywhere in a place like this without learning to go along with the current. He thought about the look on Maya's face in his office that morning. Not angry, not frightened, precise. The look of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had already accounted for it. He folded the log and put it in his jacket pocket and went back to his office and called a number he had never called before. A tip line posted on a laminated compliance card that had been stuck to the inside of his desk drawer since his floor manager. The kind of thing you acknowledge exists, but never actually expect to use. He used it. He talked for 17 minutes. When he hung up, he sat in his chair and felt something move through him that was complicated and uncomfortable, and also, underneath the discomfort, something that felt unexpectedly like oxygen. He had not felt that way in a very long time. The twist that nobody had anticipated, not Victor, not his attorney, not even the investigators who had been building their case through the afternoon, came at 5:44 in the form of a phone call to the federal field office from a blocked number. The investigator who took the call later described the voice as female, calm, and extremely precise. The caller provided 3 pieces of information in under 2 minutes. First, the location of a secondary set of financial records maintained in an offshore account management system that Russell Greer had not mentioned in his 2 hours of cooperation, either because he didn't know about it or because he had chosen to withhold it. Second, the name of a board member who had received a personal financial benefit tied to the vendor contract performance incentives. A board member whose name was not Elaine Mortimer. Third, the direct cell number of that board member. The investigator asked for the caller's name. The line went dead. The investigator ran a trace. It came back to a prepaid device purchased 14 months ago at a pharmacy 12 miles from Crestview General. The device had never been used before this call and was never used again. The secondary financial records, when accessed, contained documentation of transactions that elevated the case from significant to catastrophic for everyone involved. The board member whose name had been provided was a man named Thomas Park, 64 years old, a former insurance executive who had joined the Crestview board 4 years ago and who had sat in that morning's meeting nodding thoughtfully while Victor had managed the room. Thomas Park received a call from 2 investigators at 6:21. By 7, he had retained his own attorney, entirely separately from Victor's. By 7:30, the fact that he had retained a separate attorney had been communicated to Victor's attorney by someone in the legal community who understood that this information was relevant and time-sensitive. Victor was still in his attorney's office when this news arrived. He had been there for nearly 4 hours. He had answered questions. He had not answered other questions. He had maintained with gradually increasing difficulty the position that everything he had done at Crestview General had been within the bounds of legal administrative practice, and that any irregularities in the record were the result of a systems error that had since been corrected. When his attorney told him about Thomas Park's separate counsel, Victor's face went through several things in quick succession. His attorney watched it happen and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. "He's going to cooperate," Victor said finally. It wasn't a question. His attorney said nothing. "Tom Park is going to cooperate because Tom Park has always looked out for Tom Park, and he can see the same writing on the wall that I can see." Victor's voice was flat now, stripped of the performance quality it usually carried. It was the voice of a man reading a situation with complete accuracy for the first time in several days. "How bad is this?" His attorney looked at him steadily. "Victor, I need you to hear me clearly. The question is no longer about managing this situation. The question is about how you position yourself going forward. And that positioning needs to begin with complete honesty with me, right now, about everything." The word everything sat in the room between them. Victor thought about 11 years. He thought about 42%. He thought about the ribbon cutting and the photograph and the board members who had called him visionary. He thought about Maya Kesler falling through dark air while he straightened his tie. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. His attorney waited. "There was a nurse," Victor said, and his voice came out differently now, lower and rougher, like something had shifted in his chest. "A new hire. She found some of the billing modifications and started documenting them. I tried to manage it through HR, and it wasn't working." He stopped. His attorney was completely still. "I asked someone to handle it more directly. Last night." Victor looked at his hands on the table, the steady hands he had been so proud of. "She was on the rooftop." His attorney said nothing for a very long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and precise and contained not one single syllable of surprise, which told Victor everything about how clearly things had been visible to people outside his own head. "Is she alive?" the attorney asked. Victor looked up. "She showed up for her shift this morning." His attorney stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to Victor for approximately 10 seconds. When he turned back around, his expression had changed completely. Not to judgment. Attorneys of his caliber did not express judgment in working hours, but to something else. The particular gravity of someone recalibrating the entire scope of a problem in real time. "Victor," he said, "what you just told me changes everything." At 7:59 that evening, Maya was sitting at her desk when her phone buzzed with a message from the federal contact number. She read it again, set the phone down on the desk, and pressed both palms flat against the wood surface, and breathed, slowly, through the fractured ribs and everything else. The message said, "Formal arrest warrant being processed. Expect movement by morning. Your testimony required. Are you able?" She picked up the phone, typed 4 letters back. "Yes." She set the phone down. Outside her window, the city was doing what cities do at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, moving and lit and indifferent and alive. Somewhere in that city, Victor Haldren was sitting across from his attorney, finally telling the truth, which was its own kind of ending, even if the official ending hadn't arrived yet. Somewhere in it, Harold Briggs was eating dinner in room 412 with a chest that felt lighter. Somewhere in it, Patricia Osei was at her own desk, organizing 14 months of documentation with the focused energy of someone who had finally found the use for something they had been carrying too long. Somewhere in it, Danny Reeves was almost certainly in his clinic, running through worst-case scenarios, which was his version of showing he cared. Maya looked at the wall in front of her desk. She thought about the rooftop. She thought about 4 seconds on the concrete. She thought about the 60-second count in the parking structure with one shoulder back in its socket and 2 ribs cracked in the cold air in the clean, clear understanding of what needed to happen next and in what order. She thought about the thing her first commanding officer had told her a long time ago in a different life. He had said that the most dangerous person in any situation was not the most aggressive one. It was the one who could take the worst thing that could happen to them and turn it into a starting point. She had been 17 when he said that, and she had written it down and carried it in her wallet until the paper had softened and the ink had faded, and she had thrown it away because by then she didn't need the paper anymore. The words had moved from the paper into her bones, and they had lived there ever since. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She stood at the counter and drank it while the city moved outside, and tomorrow came closer, 1 minute at a time, carrying with it everything that was about to break open in the light. The morning came in hard and fast, the way significant mornings always do. Not with fanfare, but with the particular quality of ordinary time moving at a speed that feels slightly wrong. Like the world has shifted one gear higher without announcing it. Maya was already awake when her alarm went off at 5:30. She had been awake since 4:47, lying in the dark with her eyes open and her mind running the final checklist the same way she had run every checklist in every high-stakes situation she had ever navigated. Not anxiously, methodically, the way you check the instrument panel before you go somewhere you cannot come back from easily. Everything was in order. She got up, dressed carefully around her ribs, drank coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and was out the door by 6:15. She was not going to the hospital. Not yet. She had somewhere else to be first. The federal field office sat in a building 12 blocks north of the hospital district, the kind of building that does not announce itself, that has a lobby and a security desk and an elevator bank, and nothing about its exterior that tells you what happens inside it. Maya went through security, stated her name, and was met by a woman named Agent Sarah Caldwell, who was 43 years old and had the kind of face that had learned how to listen without reacting, which was, in Maya's assessment, one of the most professionally useful things a person could train themselves to do. They sat across from each other in a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a recording device and a window that let in the early morning gray. "I want to start by saying," Agent Caldwell said, adjusting the recorder, "that what you put together in the time you had with the resources available to you is genuinely remarkable. I've been doing this for 16 years, and the documentation trail you constructed is cleaner than what most full investigative teams produce with 6 months and a budget." "I had good source material," Maya said. "The evidence was always there. It just needed someone to look for it." Caldwell nodded. She did not ask questions about Maya's background. She had read enough of the file to understand that certain questions would not be answered and that pressing them was not productive. She was a practical woman, and she kept the interview practical. They talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Maya gave her testimony in the same organized, sequential way she had documented everything, starting from the moment she had found Harold Briggs's modified chart and moving forward through every step to the rooftop and beyond. She was specific about dates and times. She was specific about the conversation on the rooftop, Victor's exact words, the exact physical sequence of what had happened. She was specific about the awning and the parking structure and the shoulder and Danny Reeves and everything that had followed. She spoke about the patient who had not survived the readmission without looking away from Caldwell's face. She said the name. She held the weight of it. She did not let herself move past it quickly because it was the reason the rest of it mattered. It was the human fact at the center of everything, the one that all of Victor's spreadsheets and billing codes and throughput optimization language had been built to obscure. Caldwell wrote something down. When the interview ended and the recorder was turned off, Caldwell sat back and looked at Maya for a moment, in the way that people sometimes look at each other when the professional formality of a room has temporarily lifted. "The warrant was signed this morning at 6:40, she said. "He'll be taken into custody at his attorney's office. We expect that to happen within the next 2 hours. Maya nodded. "Thomas Park surrendered voluntarily at 8 last night, Caldwell continued. "He is fully cooperating. His testimony regarding the board's knowledge of the incentive structure adds a dimension to this case that is going to have consequences well beyond Haldren. Maya absorbed that. The board, some of them had known, or had chosen not to look, which in certain legal contexts amounted to the same thing. And the journalism piece? Maya asked. Our contact at the outlet confirms they're holding until we give clearance to publish. We'll give that clearance at 10 this morning. Colwell paused. Your name will be in it. I know. All of it will be in it. The rooftop, your background, the classified gaps in your record are going to generate questions. They can generate whatever questions they want, Maya said simply. The questions don't change what happened. Colwell looked at her for another moment. Are you ready for what comes after this? It was a genuine question, not a procedural one. Maya recognized the difference. I've been ready, she said, since the moment I landed. She stood up. She shook Colwell's hand. She walked back through the lobby and out through the front door into the morning air and stood on the sidewalk and took a slow, careful breath through her taped ribs and looked at the sky and let herself feel the exact weight of the moment. Just the moment. Not what came before it and not what came after. Just this. Then she started walking. It was 7:58 in the morning when Victor Haldren arrived at his attorney's office for what he believed was a continuation of the strategy session from the previous evening. He had barely slept. He looked it. The immaculate presentation that had been his professional trademark for 11 years was showing its first real cracks. His shirt was right, but his eyes were wrong. Too much behind them. Too much happening in a space that was usually smooth and controlled and carefully managed. His attorney met him at the door. The expression on the attorney's face stopped Victor on the threshold. What? Victor said. Come inside, the attorney said. What happened? Victor, inside. He came inside. He sat down. His attorney sat across from him and put both hands flat on the table, the way people do when they are about to say something that cannot be walked back. They're coming here this morning, the attorney said. The warrant was signed at 6:40. I received notification 20 minutes ago. I have to advise you that the most favorable position you can take right now, the only one that gives you any meaningful negotiating leverage, is voluntary surrender before they arrive. Victor stared at him. We have perhaps 45 minutes, the attorney said. I need you to make a decision. Victor did not move. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and looked at the table between them, and his mind ran through it all. The entire 11 years, the entire architecture of what he had built and how he had built it, and how completely it had come apart and how fast. 2 days. It had taken 2 days. From the moment Maya Kesler had walked back through the main entrance of Crestview General on Tuesday morning, it had taken 48 hours for everything he had constructed over 11 years to collapse into a set of federal charges in a room with a recording device somewhere in a building 12 blocks north. He thought about the rooftop. He thought about the way the door had closed behind him, and the way the night had been quiet, and the way he had straightened his tie and felt, for about 6 hours, like a man who had solved a difficult problem. He thought about Maya standing at the medication cart with her back to him the next morning. The absolute stillness of her. The way she had already, by that point, done everything necessary. I'll surrender, he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Smaller, like the room had changed size again. His attorney nodded once. He picked up his phone. At 8:41, Victor Haldren walked out of his attorney's office building, flanked by 2 federal agents and his own counsel. The morning was overcast and the street was doing its normal morning things. 2 people on the sidewalk stopped and stared. A woman walking a dog paused on the opposite sidewalk. Nobody said anything. The agents were professional and efficient. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes from door to vehicle. Victor did not look at the building as they drove away. He looked straight ahead through the windshield at the morning traffic and kept his face as composed as he could manage and thought about nothing that was useful to think about. Thomas Park's attorney called the board chair at 9:15 to formally notify him of his client's cooperation agreement. The board chair, a man named Richard Ashby, who had been in healthcare governance for 22 years and who had genuinely believed in Victor Haldren's leadership in a way that was now retroactively excruciating, sat in his car in his own driveway for 20 minutes after the call ended before he was able to go back inside his house. By 9:30, 4 of the 7 board members had been notified of the arrest. By 10, all 7 had been reached. By 10:15, 2 of them had retained independent counsel. Elaine Mortimer, who had made the call the previous morning to warn Victor to stop talking and who had been ignored, called Richard Ashby at 10:20 and said 6 words in a tone of voice that he would remember for the rest of his professional life. "We need an emergency board meeting," she said. "I know," Richard said. "Today, Richard, not tomorrow, today." The emergency board meeting was called for 2 o'clock. It would go for 4 hours. By the end of it, 3 things would have been formally resolved. First, Victor Haldren's employment was terminated effective immediately for cause. Second, an independent external review of the hospital's patient care protocols for the past 24 months was commissioned, with full cooperation with federal investigators mandated. Third, a motion was put forward by Elaine Mortimer and seconded by Richard Ashby to establish a patient safety leadership role reporting directly to the board, a role that had never existed before at Crestview General, a role created specifically because of the gap that Maya Kesler had identified and documented and nearly died trying to address. That motion passed unanimously. But all of that was still ahead. At 10 in the morning, Maya Kesler walked into Crestview General Hospital through the main entrance for the second time in 2 days. She was not on shift. She was not wearing scrubs. She had received a call from HR at 9:50 asking her, with a formality that barely concealed the institutional whiplash of the past 18 hours, to come in at her earliest convenience for a meeting with senior leadership. She had said she would be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 8. The meeting was in a conference room on the administrative floor, 1 level below Victor's now empty office. Richard Ashby was there. Elaine Mortimer was there. The interim acting director, a woman named Dr. Joanna Vance, who had been the hospital's chief medical officer and who had been formally asked to assume operational leadership pending the board's full review, was there. Patricia Osei was there, which was the detail that made something tighten in Maya's chest when she walked in and saw her. Because nobody had told her Osei would be present, and the sight of her, composed and upright with her folder on the table in front of her, was unexpectedly steadying. Maya sat down. She did not speak first. She had learned a very long time ago that the person who speaks first in a room like this gives away their level of need, and she did not intend to give away anything she hadn't chosen to give. Richard Ashby cleared his throat. He was a man who was visibly carrying the weight of the previous 24 hours, the particular heaviness of someone who had trusted the wrong person for a long time, and was now sitting across from one of the consequences of that trust. "Ms. Kesler," he said, "I want to begin by saying, on behalf of this board, that we owe you an apology that is entirely inadequate to the situation. What happened to you on this hospital's property at the hands of this hospital's CEO is a failure of oversight and institutional accountability that I find deeply and personally inexcusable." Maya said nothing. She watched his face. "The administrative leave initiated yesterday is rescinded effective immediately. Your position is fully restored with full back pay for the period of the leave." He paused. "We would also like to discuss, if you're willing, a new role. A role that this board is creating today." Elaine Mortimer slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Maya picked it up and read it. "Patient Safety Director. Reporting directly to the board. Full authority to review and flag clinical protocol modifications. Direct line to external oversight bodies. Immunity protections for good faith reporting." It was, essentially, The role that should have existed before any of this happened. The role that might have made the compliance office's buried report impossible to bury. The role that might have saved the patient who had not survived the readmission. Maya set the paper down. She looked at Richard Ashby. She looked at Elaine Mortimer. She looked at Dr. Joanna Vance. She looked at Patricia Osei, who was watching her with the steady calm of someone who already knew what she was going to say. "I have conditions," Maya said. Richard Ashby nodded immediately. "Name them." The independent review covers not just billing protocols, but every patient care decision that was modified under the vendor contract incentive structure. Every patient, every chart, independently audited, and the results are published, not submitted to the board and summarized. Published, in full, in accessible language, where the families of every affected patient can read them. Nobody objected. Second condition, the nurse who filed the original compliance report 14 months ago, whoever that person was, is identified, their report is formally acknowledged in the record, and if they are no longer employed here because of what they reported, this hospital makes that right. Elaine Mortimer wrote something down without being asked. Third condition, Maya paused. Harold Briggs, in room 412, receives a formal review of his entire care record for this admission and a meeting with a senior physician who can explain clearly and honestly what happened to his medication protocol and why. Not a form letter, not a risk management call, a person, in the room, telling the truth. Richard Ashby looked at Dr. Vance. Vance nodded. "Then yes," Maya said, "I'll take the role." She said it without ceremony, without performance, without the particular emotional decoration that the moment might have seemed to invite. She said it the way she did everything, directly and finally, and with full understanding of what it meant and what it was going to require. Patricia Osei released a breath that she had been holding, it seemed, for several minutes. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. There were logistics, paperwork, interim arrangements. Maya handled all of it with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. When it ended and the room began to empty, Osei stayed behind. They were the last two people at the table. Osei looked at her. Not the professional assessment look, the other one. The one Maya had seen briefly once before, in Osei's office on the morning this had all begun. The look that contained 19 years and the patient who hadn't survived and 4 compliance follow-ups that had gone nowhere. "How are your ribs?" Osei asked quietly. Maya almost laughed. "Manageable. You need imaging." "I know. Today, Maya, not when things settle down. Today." "Yes, Patricia." Osei stood up. She picked up her folder. She straightened her jacket. Then she did something she had almost certainly never done in a professional setting. She reached out and put her hand briefly on Maya's arm. Not a handshake, not a professional gesture, just a human one, brief and real and sufficient. Then she walked out. Maya sat alone in the conference room for 2 minutes. She did not fill the time with thought. She just sat with it, the silence in the morning light, and the particular quality of a thing that has been carried a long way, finally finding the place it was supposed to land. Then she went to see Harold Briggs. He was sitting up in bed when she came through the door, looking considerably better than he had 3 days ago. Color in his face, steadier eyes, the particular alertness of a body that has been given what it needed and is using it. His daughter was sitting in the chair beside him, a woman in her mid-40s with her father's careful, attentive eyes, who looked up when Maya entered and immediately stood up as if instinct required it. "You're Maya," the daughter said. Her voice had something in it. "I am," Maya said. "Dad talks about you every time I call." Maya looked at Harold. He had the expression of a man who was not embarrassed to have been accurately described. "How are you feeling?" Maya asked him, pulling up a chair. "Like myself again," Harold said. "First time since I came in." She sat with him for 20 minutes. She explained what had happened with his medication, not the full institutional picture, Not the fraud and the charges and the arrest, but the clinical truth of it. That his chart had been modified incorrectly, that the modification had delayed a necessary medication adjustment, that it had been corrected and that his current numbers were good and trending toward discharge within 2 days. She said it plainly and honestly, and she watched his face as she said it, and she answered his questions and his daughter's questions without evasion. Harold listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Was it on purpose? He asked. The modification. Maya looked at him steadily. Yes. Harold nodded slowly, the nod of someone absorbing something difficult without flinching because they have lived long enough to know that difficult things exist and that flinching doesn't help. And the person responsible is in federal custody as of this morning. Harold looked at her for a long time. His daughter had her hand over her mouth. The room was very quiet. Because of you, Harold said. Because of a lot of people, Maya said. Harold shook his head slightly. Because of you, he said again, and his voice had the quality of a final word, the kind of statement that doesn't invite argument because it is simply and entirely true. Maya held his gaze. She did not deflect it this time. She let it land. The story broke publicly at 11:47. Just under 48 hours from when Maya had given the journalist her window. The headline named Victor Haldron, named the hospital, named the federal charges, named the billing fraud and the patient care manipulation and the attempted murder. It named Maya Kesler. It described with the careful specificity of a journalist who had been working toward this story for 8 months and had finally received the piece that made it whole. What had happened on the rooftop of Crestview General 2 nights before, and what had happened after. It described the awning, the parking structure, the prepaid phone, the encrypted server, the 4 seconds on the concrete, and the choice to get back up. The story was read 14,000 times in the first hour. By evening, it had been shared across the country. By the following morning, it had traveled further than that, picked up by national outlets, translated in fragments, discussed on radio programs and in hospital break rooms, and in the comments sections of news sites, where people who had spent their working lives in healthcare found the particular kind of recognition that comes from seeing something true put into words. In one of those comments sections, someone who identified themselves only as a retired nurse from Ohio wrote 3 sentences. She wrote, "I have worked in hospitals for 31 years. I have seen what happens to people who speak up. I am so glad one of them finally had what it took to finish the fight." 3 weeks later, the independent audit began. 6 weeks after that, its preliminary findings confirmed what Maya had documented. 11 patients whose care had been materially affected by the billing incentive structure. 2 readmissions directly connected to the protocol modifications. 1 death. Her name was Eleanor Watts. She had been 67 years old. She had been a retired school teacher from a suburb 20 miles outside the city. She had a son and 2 grandchildren. The son received a personal call from Dr. Joanna Vance, now confirmed as permanent CEO, on a Thursday morning. The call lasted 40 minutes. Vance did not summarize. She did not use risk management language. She told the truth. He cried. She did not rush him. Maya was in her new office on the morning that call was made. It was a small office on the administrative floor, deliberately chosen by her over the larger one that had been offered, because the smaller one had a window that looked out over the hospital's main entrance, and she liked being able to see who was coming and going. Old habits. She had a desk and a laptop and a filing system that was already impressively organized, and a door that was open more often than it was closed. Denise appeared in the doorway at 9 that morning with 2 cups of coffee and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that said she had been waiting a reasonable amount of time before allowing herself to show up like this. "Head nurse and patient safety director," Denise said, looking at the nameplate that had been put on the door the previous day. "Don't make it weird," Maya said. "I'm not making it weird." Denise came in and set one of the cups on Maya's desk. "I'm making it observed. There's a difference." She sat down in the chair across from the desk, uninvited, with the easy authority of a woman who had been on this floor for 22 years and had earned the right to sit wherever she wanted. "You doing okay?" Maya looked at her. The question was simple, but it contained everything. The rooftop and the ribs and the 2 days and Harold Briggs and Eleanor Watts and the small office with the window over the entrance. All of it. "Yeah," Maya said. "I am." Denise looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee and nodded once, the particular nod of someone who has heard the truth and recognizes it. "Good," she said. They sat together in a comfortable working silence while the hospital moved around them the way it always moved. Monitors beeping and carts rolling and people arriving and being cared for. The ordinary ongoing business of a place where people came when they were most vulnerable and trusted that the people inside it were doing everything possible to protect them. That trust, Maya had decided, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. It was what Harold Briggs had extended when he had answered her questions honestly instead of giving her the version he told other doctors. It was what Eleanor Watts had extended when she had checked in through the main entrance below and handed herself over to people she had never met. It was what every patient on every floor extended every day. A trust that was quiet and enormous and almost entirely invisible until something broke it. And that required, every single day, people willing to protect it with everything they had. Maya had come to Crestview General 6 weeks ago as a nurse. She had come without announcement and without expectation and with nothing in her hands except the skills she had spent her life accumulating and the particular knowledge of what it meant to be the person in the room who noticed. She had been pushed off a roof for it. She had landed. She had gotten back up. She had done the work. And now she was here, in this small office with this window, with a nameplate on the door, and a coffee she hadn't touched yet going cold on her desk. And she had a job to do, and she was going to do it, and that was the whole story, complete and whole and without qualification. Some people, when the worst thing happens to them, stay in the shape it left them. They carry the outline of it everywhere they go, and it defines them and diminishes them, and that is a real and understandable thing that nobody should judge. Maya Kesler was not that person. She had never been that person. She had been built by experience and by will, and by years of being tested in ways that would break most people before they understood what was happening to them, into someone who took the worst thing and turned it into a starting point. Victor Haldren had looked at her and seen a problem to be eliminated. He had not understood that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person like Maya Kesler is try to end her. Because people like Maya Kesler do not end. They recalibrate. They get up off the concrete. They count to 60. They make the calls that need to be made and take the steps that need to be taken. And they are standing at the medication cart the next morning, composed and precise, and already 3 moves ahead when you walk past them with the blood still on your hands. He had tried to silence her. Instead, he had given her a reason to be louder than she had ever intended to be. And every patient who walked through the doors of Crestview General from that morning forward would be safer because of it. That was not a small ending. That was not a quiet one. That was the kind of ending that mattered, not because it made a good story, though it did, but because it was real, and it was permanent, and it had been paid for at a price that nobody should have had to pay. Maya picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the morning. Below, a woman was helping an elderly man through the main entrance, her hand on his arm, his steps slow and careful. They were greeted by someone at the door. He was helped inside. Maya watched them and drank her coffee and went back to work.